So we're going to talk about grazing stockpiled forage in the fall and winter. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about, of course, because I think it's probably one of the most important things, is when are you going to plant? And that really dictates what species. And also you got to think about what's the animal that you want to be grazing this material, because the quality is going to vary depending on the species you select. So my recommendation is, if you're going to plant in the summer, really up to about August 10th, August 15th, the warm seasons are going to give you the most yield. So sorghum, sudan, pearl millet. Of course, we talked a little bit about these species when we talked about grazing in the summer. And the one thing I want to remind you of is if you are trying to graze like in that frost period, pearl millet may be a better option than sorghum sudan because it doesn't produce prussic acid. However, there's kind of this like gap here where you could switch, and I could go like after about August 1st, we might recommend planting cool season winter sensitive species like oats and brassicas. Darren and I, years ago, did a study here in Lincoln where we were actually looking at kind of that transition, like from, this late July up to mid-August, which is better, planting the warm season or planting the cool season? And I'll show you just a little bit of data from that. The thing that I take away is that if I'm looking for very high quality forage, the cool season winter sensitive species are going to be very high quality. But in this early period, like late July into about the 10th of August, they're going to not produce as much biomass as the warm seasons. And the later you plant on the warm seasons, the higher quality they're going to be. So depending on your goals, like in that time frame, you kind of have two options, or maybe you can plant a mix of those species. And again, I want to remind you, after September 1st, don't even think about fall forage. I mean, in my mind, you're really better off switching to the winter hardy species and planting something like rye or winter triticale. And remember, Jerry kind of talked about this idea of mixing the winter sensitive and the winter hardy. And I think before September 1st, that's another option, because you can get some fall growth and then also still get spring growth. But remember, it's kind of a compromise. You're going to not yield more, but you're going to just have a change in distribution. Okay, so I talked about the work that Darren and I did. And so what I have here is two planting dates. I have July 22nd and I have August 16th. This is in Lincoln. This happened to be kind of a warm fall. And then we have the first three species here would be cool season winter sensitive small cereals. So cool season grasses, cool season legumes, so spring pea and spring lentil. And then we have the warm season legumes, cowpea and soybean, and the warm season grasses, sorghum sudan and pearl millet. And so probably the thing that should pop out to everybody, right, is that in this earlier planting date, this July 22nd, the warm seasons way out yielded the cool seasons, right? That's what you would expect. When we went to August 16th, though, really don't see much differences among these species in terms of yield. Statistically, there was no difference between the warm season grasses and the cool season grasses. Numerically, maybe even the warm seasons out yielded the cool seasons. So if we look at this, earlier planting, warm seasons seem to be ideal, right? Which makes sense. If we look at the quality, so this is in vitro dry matter digestibility. You can just think about this like energy. And of course, the higher the number, the more energy that would be available. And what I really wanted you to notice here is if you look at even this July planting, so July 22nd, and you look at the cool seasons, okay, one of these is not like the other. Oats, these spring oats versus spring triticale and spring barley, are very different. This happened to be an earlier maturing oat, and it shows. It went more reproductive, and so the quality was quite low on it relative to the triticale and the barley. And this is, to be clear, I don't think this is really a species thing. It's really a variety thing. But it really does point out something that's really useful for you to understand. There is a time period where it almost seems too early to plant oats or barley or triticale if they're not a late maturing variety. And that would be what I would say about this kind of late July period. We did this probably 5 years ago. We planted about the same time. We were trying to get some fall forage for lactating cows, and we had the same thing happen. The oats that we planted were not a late maturing variety, so they came up, they put on a seed head, they really didn't have much for leaf, and basically we had straw. So if you're planting really early, I do think, and you're going to plant this cool season, I do think late maturing makes sense. The other thing I wanted to point out is look at the warm season grasses. So look at the sorghum, sudan, and pearl millet. And the energy content here, so the digestibility is around 60%, which is pretty good, right? So the quality is actually fairly high, because remember, we're kind of planting late, and so they're not getting super mature. We harvested all of this in November. So with the later planting, the quality is still pretty doggone good. And then the later we go, the quality is even better. And in fact, these warm season grasses are really still very, very high quality, because of course the yield was lower and the maturity was lower. So bottom line, probably high quality forage if we're looking at this July, August planting time, unless you plant kind of an earlier maturing small cereal, and then it might bite you if you plant it too early. So we talked a bit about grazing warm seasons when we talked about grazing warm seasons in one of our past sessions. And I don't really want to go back over that specifically. The value of strip grazing those warm seasons was quite high, and the value of allowing the cattle to be selective can improve performance. But I did want to show you just a little bit of data. We had some sorghum sudan last year that we planted after rilage. And so we planted it mid-June, excuse me. So it was planted mid-June. And then the weather kind of didn't cooperate. And this field happens to be in some bottomland. It's hard to get to. So we didn't get it harvested, and it was out there. And so we decided that in November, we were going to actually swath graze this to utilize it. So this is kind of what it looked like in early November. We swathed it, and the quality was fairly good. It was 63 TDN in early November. The thing that was the kicker was that the protein was really low. And this is what we typically see with the warm season grasses, is that as they mature, the protein can get quite low, especially once they go dormant. So 5% crude protein wasn't very high. We decided to do a trial where we wanted to look at strip grazing, and we looked at allocation. So we either allocated new strips once a week or twice a week. That was the comparison. And we didn't see any difference in individual animal performance, so average daily gain, due to the allocation frequency. But we did see an increase in the amount of grazing we could get, so the number of AUMs. We basically went from about 5 AUMs an acre to 6 AUMs an acre on this sorghum sudan if we allocated twice a week versus once a week. So again, you have to decide how much is your labor worth and how much is your forage worth. But in this case, more frequent did improve harvest efficiency. Animal performance wasn't very good, which is not unexpected. They gained about 0.5 pound a day. We didn't supplement because again, this field is kind of remote and hard to get to. So we did provide lick tubs, not my favorite thing in the world. They're 24% crude protein lick tub. So protein was likely our limiting factor on these animals. The other thing I wanted to show you here, though, was that November 9th, 63 TDN, January 4th, 53 TDN. So the sorghum Sudan did lose quite a bit of energy over the winter, about 10 TDN units over that 2-month period. So just recognize that the feeding value does decline over the winter for the sorghum Sudan, even in these swaths. We didn't see a huge amount of mold. We did get a lot of snow towards the end of this grazing, and actually we ended up stopping grazing due to the amount of snow that we got, that the cattle were trying to break through. When they did find a swath and they would start working at it, they could get to it fairly well. And in fact, when we pulled these calves, we went back out with cows later, and one of the things I noticed is the cows seem to be much more proficient at getting to the forage than the stocker calves are. So now let's talk a bit about late summer planting of cool seasons. I do think that from a high quality perspective, the cool seasons are a great option. Oats and rapeseed are kind of my favorite right now. Remember, we're really talking about this early to mid-August planting times, kind of optimal for them. And then we have some high quality forage that you can graze, say, your weaned calves with, or fall calving cows. You can even graze dry cows on it, but if you do that, then I would say allocation is extremely important, because the feed value is so high that they don't really need a lot of it. You can start limit feeding them and being able to maintain performance and really capture the value of that forage. Honestly, if you're doing dry cows and you can plant in this early August period, I'd probably go with warm seasons, because likely, if you have a warm fall, you're going to get more yield. And if you don't, you're still not out anything, in my opinion, because the quality is still going to be pretty good. Planting date really does matter. And I keep telling you, September 1st, this is the difference 2 weeks makes. 1.5 tons versus 1/4 ton. So huge difference in the amount of growth you're going to get. So this is why I say kind of drop dead date is at September 1, because really after that date, you're not going to get a lot of forage production. Similar example, this is just the difference in planting August 25th versus September 8th. So again, 2 weeks difference. How much difference does that make in the amount of forage? It's huge, because the growing degree days are really dropping precipitously. So one of the challenges that I see is, like, if you have the plan, but you don't execute it quickly, that you have the same amount of money invested here, right? In the seed and in the seeding, and yet the amount of production is it's not even half, right? It's much less. And so this is one of the things that I think is really important, that if you're going to do it, get it in as quickly as possible. I talked a little bit about early versus late maturing, and what I have here is actually, this is a study from Wisconsin. So I have put in our dates for what these growing degree days would represent. So basically we have mid-August here as the first date, and then early to mid-September, depending on where you're at. So September 20th would be down in far southeast Nebraska, and September 11th would be up in the reverse, actually, excuse me. September 11th would be in far southeast Nebraska. So basically, we look at this as kind of August versus September, early September planting. So mid-August versus early September planting. And I wanted to show you the difference in the quality. So if we look at the TDN of early versus late, and you look at it for early planting, what we see is that this is like the earlier, this is in August. We're seeing a difference here in the quality. The late maturing is higher quality. And if we were to go even earlier in planting, this is going to be even more exaggerated. However, when we do late planting, we see no difference in the quality. And so usually these late maturing varieties are a little bit more expensive. So if you're going to be planting early, I think they're worth the cost. If you're going to be planting later, they're probably not worth the cost because we really don't see differences in yield or quality the later we go. So I say early planting, early summer period there, we're going to plant, go for the late maturing. Otherwise, you can use a mid maturing. I wouldn't suggest a really early maturing, just to be clear. Jerry talked a little bit about the different oats and, mid maturing, dual purpose versus the forage. And this is really kind of what we're talking about here. I think for spring, the late maturing makes a lot of sense too. But we can kind of skimp a little bit on seed cost the later we plant into the summer. So I also think that brassicas are kind of a slam dunk when it comes to this late summer planting. So I particularly like rapeseed. And the reason I like rapeseed is because it is cheap. And it produces a taproot rather than a tuber. So this is kind of what its root looks like. So it puts more energy into leaf than it does into root. And I like that because I can manage the grazing a little bit better. If you've ever watched cattle, they go and they graze off the tops. So they'll graze the grass and they'll graze the leaf off of the brassica, and then they'll come back and eat the tubers. And unfortunately, what that means is that you usually have bare ground at the end. In the case of having a leafy type brassica like the rapeseed, I can keep as much residual as I want while utilizing more of the total forage because they don't put so much of the growth into that root mass. So 50 pounds of oats and 3 pounds of rapeseed is kind of the mix we've been using. It comes up at about 30% brassica, which is really nice. We've grazed about 600 calves over 3 years and found that we get a little bit of boost in individual animal performance. This is statistically increased, interestingly enough. It's pretty doggone consistent. The mix is actually cheaper than the 100 pounds oats, although I will say, like Jerry talked about, I don't think we need to go that high on the oat monoculture, and so we could save money that way. The other thing that I want to point out is that when we looked at finishing these calves, so we took calves, they were weaned, we put them out here on this material in November. We grazed them until January or February. They were typically around 800 pounds, and then we put them into the feedlot and finished them. When we look at their finished performance, and one of the things that we saw was that the calves who were on the oat rapeseed mix actually had better marbling than those who were on the oats alone, which was totally unexpected, but it was consistent. And so there was something going on there. The marbling, though, was similar to the marbling of calves that we actually had stuck straight into the feedlot and fed them like a growing ration up until 800 pounds. So it was a corn silage-based ration. So it's not extreme, right? But it was better than the oats alone, which is really interesting. The other thing I want to point out is that the quality of oats and brassicas it does retain fairly well over the winter. The first initial losses is sugar content. And so we do see, again, about a 10 percentage unit loss in TDN from November to December, but the quality is still very, very high. I mean, 67 TDN is better than any hay you're going to have. And the protein is also very high. Brassicas are very high protein. And the oats can be, depending on how much nitrogen is in the field. In fact, sometimes one of the challenges is that we can see that we'll have high nitrates in these late summer planted forages. However, because the quality is high, we don't see a lot of negative effects of grazing these. I will point out that this is one situation where if I have high nitrates and I'm going to graze, I would prefer continuous or set stocking, because that allows them to graze top down and work their way into the higher nitrate material. So I just have nutritive value here of, this is a radish top, a turnip top, and an oats. And I will say, we haven't really seen very much differences among the brassicas in terms of their protein and energy. There's a little bit of difference in terms of like the bulbs themselves, like with radish and turnip. The turnip holds its value a little bit better than the radish, but in general, we're really not seeing a bunch of differences. So if we look at brassicas and we look at that leafy material, the one thing I really want to point out, it's very, very high quality. It's kind of like a concentrate. I talk about it like it's like, honestly, it's like corn grain with alfalfa in a river, right? It's very high moisture, very high energy, and also very high protein. So I kind of think of the brassicas like a concentrate. It's a supplement. I do need something that's higher fiber, like the oats in the mix. That's why I kind of like that 30% rapeseed, 70% oats. And you will see the oats retain their value quite well as well, but not quite as good as the brassicas. So that's another thing. I think the brassicas have a little bit of buffering capacity in terms of retaining their feed value. In general, we got about 1.4 AUMs an acre with this late summer planting. These are all set stock situations or continuous grazed. And the interesting thing that we observed was that the amount of grazing we got is not correlated to the amount of forage that was out there. In a particularly cold year, we would get more grazing than in a warmer year. And of course, drier years, we get more grazing than in wet years, especially wet and warm. In fact, this very first one where we got the least amount of grazing actually had the most amount of biomass out there. There was an additional challenge to this particular location. It was after wheat, and we had put in a bunch of liquid manure on that field. So the field was fairly worked before we planted the oat brassica mix. And that means we didn't have like really good soil structure. And so what happened is we had a lot of pugging losses. So cattle trampled in a lot of forage in this particular situation. But this was really interesting to me because it really made me think, how do I capitalize on more of the forage that's out there? So how do I get this number up? And out at US Mark, they were using oat brassica mix about the same time that I was playing around with some of this. And one of the things that they did was use a pivot fence. And they were grazing dry cows out on this pivot of oats and brassicas. And because the quality is so high, you can limit feed them. And so that's what they were doing. I actually took a napkin one day when I went out there and we were talking about it. And I was like, how much are you giving them? Because they were allocating based off of forage utilization and really making them clean it up. And I was like, how much are you giving them? So I did the math on the quality and the amount that they were giving, and it was like spot on to meet requirements. And they got 4.4 AUMs an acre. So they almost tripled what we were getting with the set stocking, which really made me wonder, you know, how much value can we have with strip grazing? So we did a series of studies on strip grazing. And in particular, most of this was with these cool seasons like the oats and brassicas. And one that I wanted to show you was a replicated study where we did this oat rapeseed mix again. We had 3 groups that were continuously grazed and 3 groups that were strip grazed. And we stocked the continuous at about a calf an acre. This is kind of what it looked like in mid-November when we turned out. The oats were frost damaged, but still green. By early December, everything had kind of browned off. But the rapeseed was still green the early January. And in fact, every time we gave the strip grazing calves access to a new strip, the first thing they did was go and select out the rapeseed. As you can see, both of these have rapeseed in their mouth, and even this guy back here had rapeseed in his mouth. So they really did like the rapeseed later. The other thing I wanted to point out is that you can see the snow is fairly high in here. It's up to about their knees. The standing material collected snow. And so compared to the continuous graze where the snow blew off because they had trampled all the forage by that point, the strip graze, the snow was actually up to the level of the standing forage. And in fact, this was almost belly level at this point for the strip graze calves. And we did start allocating a little bit more forage, and I thought this was going to be a huge problem, but the calves seemed to graze through it no problem at all. In fact, in early February of that particular year, we had the polar vortex come through, and it was -50 wind chill, and I was worried about the calves. So we went out and supplemented sweet bran. So the continuous graze calves came up and started eating the sweet bran right away. The strip graze calves had gotten a new strip, and they did turn around and look at me going, "What are you doing?" After 2 hours, they still had not came over and started to clean this up. They were perfectly content going and grazing into the snow to get their brassica in particular. And this is what the energy value, so think about this as TDN. So TDN started out here about 72, 73, again, almost corn silage like energy. In the strip graze, we do see a mild decline in the value of the forage, so the energy content due to weathering. But we are still somewhere around, 65 to 66% TDN. Even by, this was 70 days into grazing, this was mid-January. However, with the continuous graze, of course, they're selecting the higher quality components like the rapeseed early, so the feeding value is declining more precipitously over the winter just because of what they're selecting, right? They're eating the candy first. And that's probably why we see what we see in terms of the individual animals like wanting to go and eat the sweet bran in the continuous graze versus the strip graze. But individual animal performance, because they're more selective in the continuous, is better. So I have my continuous grazed versus my strip grazed here. The number of head days of grazing per acre, so you can kind of think about this as carrying capacity, was 86% more in the strip graze. So we almost doubled the amount of grazing we could get by stripping. And I should point out, we strip grazed by moving twice a week. Individual animal performance did decrease 16%. So we went from that 2 pound a day to about 1.7. And the gain per acre, though, because of the increased carrying capacity, it increased by about 56%. So our cost to gain, because we distributed all of our seed cost and seeding and fertilizer over more gain, was actually tended to be less in the strip, even though we charged like $26 an acre for labor for strip grazing. So of course, the more expensive the forage is, the more value you're going to have out of allocating that forage. One of the reasons why we got more grazing days because our harvest efficiency was increased. We saw about an 8% loss of forage due to trampling in the strip versus 57 in the continuous. Now, I understand that some people may talk about the value of trampling The way I see it is I like to have the cattle process it first and put it out the back end, and utilize more of that forage, as long as I keep enough forage on the ground, to reduce erosion and that type of thing. We worked with 4 other cooperators, where they were strip grazing versus continuous grazing. And they really saw the same thing. On average, 55% increase in grazing capacity. So 1.2 to 1.7 AUMs per acre is what they got. But there was a wide range from 12 to 118% increase. And those differences, of course, are due to differences in management. Some guys daily strip grazed. Some guys, most did once a week. A few did twice a week. And one other thing I'll point out is strip grazing in the winter. It is no fun when you have to pound the post into the ground. Although I didn't find that nearly as annoying as trying to get them out of the ground when they're frozen in. So when we were doing the swath grazing, we actually used tumble wheels. And I will say that I was pretty impressed with them. They're pretty neat in that the way they work, they have this little plate in here, and whatever is down, whatever spokes are down are not hot, but all the spokes that are up are hot. And the cattle respected it very well. They were very easy to move. So I thought that they were worth the investment. They are a little bit pricey, but they did make life easier. I'm also interested in the future. Virtual fencing may be something that really makes this really easy, right? So I think there are going to be opportunities to use technology to make this work for us.